Welcome. Emotions are everywhere. So how can we be smarter with our feelings? The answer is emotional intelligence, or EQ. We're delighted you're watching, because at 6 Seconds, we're working towards 1 billion people practicing the skills of emotional intelligence. Can we count you in? Here on 6 Seconds channel, you'll find practical skills for work and life, inspiration for today, and support to build a better future for all.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. For those of you who is morning in your area, good evening. I'm delighted to have you back at our weekly live stream show. Every week we talk about different topics where emotional intelligence plays a role in our lives and in our work. And this week is very interesting. We're going to talk about parenting, how this specific point in time has changed some of the challenges and the joys of parenting, have been all stuck at home for a while, and then all the things that are going on, especially being in the US, all the things that are going on with racial inequality and police brutality. And I'm sure a lot of conversations at the dinner table with your family and kids, probably everywhere around the world. Right before we get started, we have a great panel, so stick around. I wanted to mention a couple of things. So this is part of our Grow You weekly set of classes. And so I wanted to share the schedule with you really quick. This is the rest of the week. As you can see, there are a few sessions highlighted, one of which is today's. But make sure you don't miss your own UEQ profile group debrief on Friday. If you didn't have a debrief yet and you don't know what UEQ is, please let us know. It's a great report that you can get for free, and this is a great chance to get a debrief and learn a little more about yourself. And then next week, we're going to have another panel on Tuesday at our usual time at 8 a.m. Pacific time. And we're going to be focusing on management, and so how in this specific moment managers need to shift their patterns, their paradigm. And then last thing I want to mention is that if you don't know anything about 6 Seconds, come to the session at 6 a.m. Pacific on June 29th. So that was going to give you a great overview. One more thing, today is parenting, and under the show notes on the YouTube description, you can see a couple of really useful links for articles and the Wholehearted Parenting book that Joshua Freedman, our CEO, wrote a few years ago. And with that, I'll welcome him into the stream.
Hey, Tom. Thank you.
Bye.
So I was just thinking about, Tom was talking about next week's show for managers and how, as the world is changing, management needs to change. And I think probably the same thing we could say about parenting, that maybe what was even working or sort of working for us a few months ago, maybe isn't really working now. And in new contexts and in new situations. And as our kids get into new ages and stages, we need to figure out new ways. And that requires a lot of adaptability. And I don't know about for you, is been one of the most fun, but also one of the most difficult parts of parenting for me. Those of you who are joining us live, I would love to have you introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're from. Tell us something about this topic that's interesting to you. And I see some people who I've seen before here. Thank you for joining us from all around the world. And really, one of my favorite things about our work is this global community, and the fact that we can come together despite pandemics and despite whatnot, and be together a little bit, even if in this sort of unusual way. So please interact on the chat, because we'll bring it into the conversation. And in one of our earlier panels, we discussed the intense challenges that the pandemic was creating in schools and what's going on for kids. And some of the panelists were just talking about this before we went on, that the context of education is shifting in a way that's very difficult for educators and kids and parents. As the parent of 2 college students, I'm seeing that too. And it's like all their plans disrupted, everything that they were sort of had been planning in some cases for years. is suddenly not going to happen the way they planned it. And when you're a young adult, I think for all of us, that's quite difficult. But I think when you're a young adult, in some ways, it's even more difficult. And at the same time, we're seeing young adults leading this massive movements against racism, against climate destruction, uh, trying to find their voice in the midst of all of this chaos and difficulty. And I think in some ways, I think a lot of us as parents are looking at our kids and saying we failed them. And like, why are they having to do this? And on the other side, for me, uh, I'm seeing my kids in a new way in this time and really getting to appreciate different things about them. So I think it's a complicated time for all of us. And I think that complication is perhaps magnified when you're a young adult. So we're going to bring our panelists in to talk about our experience as parents and working with young adults, and what's happening with our emotional intelligence and how can we figure out a way through this messy moment. So welcome, panelists. And we're going to start with a question that I would like each of you to answer. Introduce yourself and then tell us one phrase that you're hearing from young people, one line of a song, one sentence that captures for you what's been going on. Annie, can we start with you?
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I think it's wonderful, and I'm proud to be part of this. The phrase that I'm hearing is "it's not fair," and that is relating to these failed expectations of the senior prom, the graduation, the first year in college, all of that stuff. But also promises. I'm hearing emails, just to let you know, I've been on the receiving end of emails from tweens and teens around the world for the last 23 years. And the tone of them has obviously been changing since around April. And these failed promises, I was going to get a new phone. You said we could do this summer. And there's a certain, hey, guess what, egotism and self-centeredness that comes with this age that is making it hard for them to shift when their parents' economic security has shifted. And some of the kids I've been talking to need to kind of figure out what the rules are now, and can I trust my parents when they say something's going to happen. I try to help them bridge those failed expectations with some compassion and empathy for the anxiety and the ground shifting underneath their parents' feet as well.
Jacques Philippe, what about you? Introduce yourself and tell us what's a phrase you're hearing from your kids.
Sure. Thanks again, Josh, for organizing this. What I do, my biggest job by far is being a parent of two. So thanks for creating this space to allow us to have this conversation. Professionally, I run a venture fund that invests in underrepresented founders, namely women and minorities and immigrants in the tech. With respect to this question, I would say I've primarily gotten divergent views. So I have an 11-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter, and their opinions are in conflict. And so for the younger boy, he's actually happy to be able to have more flexibility, be home, wake up later. The one recurring thing I hear from him is why I have the basketball hoops been taken down. And with my 15-year-old daughter, who's really been enjoying her first year of high school, the view is different in that she was getting into a groove and she misses her friends. And, she's looking forward to this being over. And, she feels, going back to what was just said, there's a certain fairness that is not there. Now, one thing I would say is I've been pleasantly surprised by her empathy because, she has a number of upperclassmen friends who, graduated this year, and you could tell she feels bad for them because she knows that proms and certain special things were meant to happen this spring, and they did not happen. But generally speaking, those are the two views I've gotten from the young people that I spend the most time with.
Thank you, Jacques Philippe.
Sure.
Laura, how about you? What are you hearing from college campuses around the country?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm Laura Horn, Chief Program Officer at Active Mind. We're a national nonprofit working to support the mental health of young adults. The one word that comes to mind for me over and over again right now is validation. We're hearing from our students, there's a lot of variation, as Jacques Philippe was speaking to, in what they're experiencing. Some students, experiencing disappointment or sadness or, some stress. Other students, I think, are experiencing financial setbacks within their families, very real, tangible impacts from the pandemic, from the racial tension that we're experiencing, and other current events. So I think students, regardless of where they are in their experiences, are really looking for a lot of validation. They're looking for the people in their lives to believe them, to have empathy for what they're experiencing, no matter how small or how big, and to journey with them through that and model some self-care, positive mental health behaviors through it.
Yeah, and on that theme of mental health behaviors, I just noticed Matt's comment in the chat here about kids who may be suicidal or ideating, and I know that it's unfortunately one of the leading causes of death among young people is suicide, and I think that there's the mental health pressures are intense, and so I know a lot of you work in that space. On the other hand, I think some people are navigating well, and so again, those of you in the chat, please share your perspectives on what's happening for you and where you're coming from. Kishan, good to see you from Pune. Zahir, let's go to you. What's the phrase you're hearing from your kids in Cape Town?
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me as well. I've got two kids. One is 14 years old, and the other one is going on 22. And diverse opinions. The one from 14 is simply said, "Daddy, I just want to play. I want to socialize. I want to be with my friends." It's as simple as that. And when I speak to him about Corona, he says, "I don't care. I just want to be with my friends." The 22-year-old, it's a little bit more complicated, and he says that, it's a time of his life that is two words. He said purpose and uncertainty. Purpose in the sense of, I'm at a time of my life where I'm trying to find my purpose and my space in this world. And just when I think I'm beginning to get it together, all this uncertainty is thrown upon us, and I've got to deal with this chaos over and above finding my purpose. And now when I thought I'm getting somewhere, I'm even more lost. And funny enough, I spoke to a kid that we've got a little squatter camp about, say, 1 kilometer away from where I live. And this girl came along and she asked for something. And I said, well, let me do a little interview with you. There's no freebies today. And I asked her as well, what do you miss most? And of all the things that we can think of that's going wrong in the place where they stay and the socioeconomic conditions, she simply said, I want to be with my friends. I want to be at school. I love my teacher. I want to do my work and my homework, and I want to just play. And that's it. Nothing else. No Corona, no stress, nothing. So that's the diverse views that we seem to be getting.
Yeah, and I think adolescents are supposed to be social. Like that's what their job is. And then we say, okay, stay home for some amount of time. How long? I don't know. Can I go back to school in the fall? I don't know. Laura, I'm curious about my sense from my own college students is that they're pretty uninterested in online learning at university. What are you hearing from students in this uncertainty about what's going to happen in the fall?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I really resonate with what Zahir shared, is that as soon as we get settled in the new normal, things change again. Things are changing so often and frequently through this period. So a lot of, I think, what we need to get through this time is just the ability to weather the storm. Whatever might be thrown at us, we don't really know what the fall will look like. So being able to kind of roll with what is being thrown at us and to do it together, I think is a big piece of it. Students shared in a nationwide survey that we conducted in April that the number one thing they were struggling with during the pandemic was staying focused on schoolwork. And I think remote learning is an aspect to that, but it's so much bigger than that. There's so much we are experiencing in terms of our emotions, in terms of our basic needs, or navigating living at home with parents. If you're a college student, you've had to return and live with your parents again, or maybe rooming with roommates, or having conversations with your parents about the mental health challenges you might be experiencing for the first time under the strain of the pandemic. All of these different factors are happening at the same time, and so of course our students are having trouble focusing on their schoolwork in the same way that I expect many of us, I know myself, sometimes they're struggling with work during this time. There's just a lot going on. And so I think, what we're talking to parents a lot about is giving grace to ourselves while navigating the pandemic and the work that we're all doing at the same time that we're trying to parent, and offering that same grace to our young adults and our students. And I think maybe even during the pandemic for the first time, I think many parents might have a sense of what it's like to be a young adult, navigating mental health challenges and trying to balance schoolwork and other responsibilities at the same time. In a way, I think we all are having a taste of what it's like to experience challenges with our mental health during this crisis.
I want to go to another pandemic of racism. And I shared with the panelists, I listened to Facing the Wind, New York Times Sunday read on Sunday, which was Father's Day in the US, and just sobbed listening to it. There's so many beautiful pieces. Carvel Wallace is the writer and narrator, and he's the parent of 2 teenagers. And there's this one line where I don't even know if I can talk about it without crying. But there's this one line where he talks about going to, his kids are going to this protest. And he says, I didn't bring them there, I met them there. And like looking at, I don't know, there's just so much in it. But this moment of meeting our kids where they are in this time where I think fortunately, but difficultly, we're grappling with so many issues, and racism is really up for the next gen. Anybody have a comment on that? What are your kids saying about the uprising? Jacques Philippe, can we start with you?
Sure. There's a lot there. I know we have limited time, so I'll try to keep it as short as possible. On the one hand, I'm big on perspective. And so, the whole idea of challenges, whether it's the pandemic or the racism, I've always tried to ensure that my children know that challenges are actually beautiful and they're a beautiful part of life. And so it's kind of preparing for these types of things. So that's one thing that I would share. The other is with respect to the kind of protests that are happening now. The perspective, relates to my own experiences. So, I've seen a lot of these things. Most people of color in the United States or in, most parts of the Western world have seen this their whole lives. If anything, it's gotten better, not worse over time. And so, I find that my children find it to be challenging because they've been somewhat sheltered to the realities that, some of us have experienced throughout our lives. And so what I try to do is make sure they understand that this has been going on for a long time. We've experienced it. And this is an opportunity for them to participate in the solution and to try to, answer the questions that they have. And then the other thing that I personally think is important that I try to impart on them and we have conversations around is how we experience these challenges. So one of the things I've done during quarantine is read a lot more. I think since April, I've read 18 books. One of them was the Master Key System, which talks about the law of attraction and how that relates to the things that we do and our experience in life. And so I choose to attract positivity and a sense of joy in all that I do. And I think oftentimes we're scared to do that. Kind of society espouses a sense that, we have to be miserable because certain things are happening or because we're working on tough things. And so I choose not to have that paradigm, and I share that with my children, and we have those conversations, and I think that's helpful. And the last thing I would mention on this topic, again, relates to perspective. And the book I read I'm reading is Sapiens. And so when you think of humanity over the course of 2 million years, what we're dealing with right now is actually almost insignificant relative to challenges that humanity have faced. And so part of the reason that we take it so seriously is massive egos. And so to me, it's important that we put our egos in check and that we do what we can to be part of the solution, understanding that, we're one of 7 billion currently living. And, again, my key refrain with respect to this is one of perspective while still giving room to feel and to experience things.
That's sounds like very practical parenting. And I imagine that when they're in their 20s, your kids will look back and be grateful for that. And maybe you're not quite to the full-on eye-rolling yet. But it's an interesting period of time where we bring our wisdom forward. And our kids...
So I feel like I should comment on that. So I've literally been speaking with my kids in that way their whole lives. My father did the same thing with me. He's like a philosopher and engineer. English was my third language. And so I think when you treat children as future adults and have real conversations with them their whole lives. So the eye rolling started happening for me, probably 10 years ago to the point where it doesn't happen as much because they expect that. And I expect of them, thorough conversations and everything's on the table. So it's just part of my approach, and it's worked so far. And I didn't create it, and I benefited from it myself.
Thank you for sharing that. Zahir, you're in a very different cultural context, and yet these same issues about purpose and race and identity and belonging have been a big part of, I'm sure, what kids have grappled with in your country for many years. What's going on with your kids in terms of their perceptions about race and racism and what they're seeing in the protests?
I guess right now it's not affecting our kids that much, and that we've moved on. But I can perhaps cite a couple of examples. For myself, even, I come from an era where we fought against the apartheid system, so I can speak to you as a kid at the time and what my parents was going through, and probably what we are doing these days ourselves. One is that as parents, we all want what's best for our kids. And we are probably more submissive, the older folk, in terms of, just doing with what we've got. For example, we would, for instance, stay in a job longer, even though we don't like it. The kids of today are saying, no, if you don't treat me well, I'm going to move on. Doesn't matter, they're on their third and fourth and fifth jobs. So they're not going to wait to be treated respectfully. They're going to move on. So from a parent's point of view, we're more submissive. We have fear for our kids, for ourselves. We're more anxious when there's uprisings. What is going to happen to them? Are they going to get caught by the police? Are they going to have a record and things like that? Where I think even myself in those days, we felt anger, we felt frustration, we felt rage, we felt disgust. And because of that, we wanted something better, and we didn't really care of the consequences at that time. All we wanted was we want to make things right. So we have this dichotomy of what the parents want, what they were feeling, and their emotions the submissiveness and fear and anxiousness. And from the kids, they were just saying, we are turning our anger and our frustrations and our rage, but we want something better. We want something more purposeful in life. We want to achieve. We want achievement through this, through our rage and our anger. We want achievement. We want better. So we have this dichotomy of things that we had. So what do we talk about with our kids these days when we are not facing it so well? And to some extent they are, because my kid has gone to a multiracial school, for example, and there they embrace each other, and it's kind of get along. And afterwards, when you're in the job market, it's something subtle. When you're in the job market these days, it's still a color issue. There's still privilege. There's still white privilege, and there's still black privilege in a South African context. Sometimes you weren't white enough, and now you're not sometimes black enough. So there's frustration coming in after you were my friend and I didn't see color, and now all of a sudden I get out of school from the safety of the parameters of school, and now I'm faced with color issues again, and I'm faced with inequities again. And so again, this type of emotion starts to raise. But what we do talk about in our family is probably about purpose and keeping the end in mind. And especially where the 6 seconds competencies comes in is when you can't stop them from attending rallies, you can't stop them from participating, but what you can teach them is what is the values, what is the end in mind of all of this, what is the consequences, so that whatever happens, you understood the consequences. You can, whatever the feelings you have, you can navigate those emotions and not going to rage and damage property, but you can actually use it fruitfully and productively by keeping the end of mind of what the purpose really is and what you really want to achieve out of this, and not deviate from it. So that's probably the context that I can give you from a South African perspective.
Yeah, and I think both of you brought up this idea of broader perspective. Annie, maybe we could talk about this question of purpose and how do we help teenagers, young adults? Do we have any role as parents in helping them identify and understand purpose, especially in this moment when it all seems disrupted?
Well, Joshua, I'm so glad that you referenced that wonderful article from the Times on Father's Day. Harper Wallace did an amazing job, brought me to tears as well. But that same phrase jumped out at me, to meet them where they are. I think too often parents have felt it was our purpose to define purpose or a goal for our kids. And for me, meet them where they are really means to listen more than talk, to find out for them what is important to them, where their passions lie. And in this time of upheaval, to do what we can to lead them to opportunities so that they feel empowered as part of the solution, rather than watching this deluge of events sweep by them. This is a historic time that we're living in. And I think as responsible parents, we want our children to take active roles in making the world a safer, saner, and more equitable place for all of us. So what can we do to help to listen to our kids and help them find those opportunities to use their power and their insight and their passion and idealism?
I'm just seeing this comment from Kathy Lee, which maybe in some way speaks to that there are these ideas that maybe we haven't, we've just normalized. And maybe when you're, 16 or 19 or 25 or whatever, you look at that and you go, that's not right. And that can create some tension. I've definitely had some challenges where my kids come home and say, you're wrong about this, and you're wrong about this, and you're wrong about this. But they've challenged me to think about some of those things that I haven't really been thinking about. Laura, let's go over to you and come back to this theme about mental health. And given this space that we're in right now, is there a piece of advice you'd give us as parents to help our kids with their mental health and going through this pandemic time and this upheaval time?
Sure. Josh, the one thing that students said in our survey that would be most helpful to them in their mental health right now is for their parents to spend time with them. And in reading that, I'm a parent of 3, and that really spoke to me. I mean, they don't need necessarily to talk about the ins and outs of everything that's going on. They don't need you to fix the problems. And as Annie said, I think listening is such a powerful thing we can do for our young adults. And most of all, they just want us to be there for them. They don't need us to fix it. They just need us to spend time with them. And unfortunately, for many parents, that's the number one thing that's most challenging right now, is being able to spend meaningful time and be present with our kids while we're also, struggling under the stress and strain of what the pandemic might be throwing at us. Maybe we're balancing work while we're parenting. And I think, again, as best as we can, offering really meaningful opportunities to be with our kids, to listen to them, to spend time with them is the number one thing that we're hearing from young adults. They say that their parents can do for them right now.
Well, I think there's an interesting piece to this, which I experienced when my older child was a few years ago, said to us, I want to tell you this and I don't want you to try to fix it. And I don't know about others here, but we certainly had many moments of trying to jump in and fix things. And that's not the same as listening. Anybody share that experience? Just me.
Yeah, but perhaps if I can add on to that. I mean, I've had an experience where I chat to my son and I tell him, what, I want to do the best as a father, and I want the best for you as my kids. And if I'm not here, I don't want to find you wanting, and so forth and so on. And he actually told me, but Daddy, when are you going to live? If you're going to be worrying about me and you're going to be worrying about my grandkids, your grandkids, my kids, and you want to make it right for everybody, when are you going to live? It's time you enjoy yourself and you also live, and leave us to carve our way out in life. You're doing the best already for me. Your responsibility is me as your kid, and that's where it stops. And then I've got to carve my way forward. And it brings me to back to what the poet says, Khalil Gibran, where he says, our children comes through us and not from us. And so we need to detach ourselves at some point to understand that we are only responsible for guiding them, but not choosing their life, and their outcomes it's going to be chosen by themselves.
Jacques Philippe, I see a little chuckle there, maybe resonating with what some people are saying in the chat.
I chuckled because Zahir was right on so many fronts, and then he closed it with literally the quote that I was going to share later, which I just pasted the whole excerpt from Khalil Gibran there on children. And I think it's spot on. It's kind of, the children come through us, but they're not of us. And, they're sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, et cetera, et cetera. And so I chuckled because of how synchronous the two of us were. So that's all it was. I'm
going to paste it into the public chat here for everybody. And it's a very interesting puzzle to figure out where do we end and where do our children begin, and how do we do our own work of emotional intelligence to make space for them to do theirs.
I wanted to say that, first of all, Khalil Gibran, and that I was thinking the same thing. They dwell in the house of the future, and we can't go there with them. And that idea of guiding them and modeling in our own lives how to face challenges, how to listen to others, how to learn from them. We want to teach respect. We have to treat our children with respect, and all the things that we want them to embody as they move towards their dwelling in the house of the future is the way that we treat them. And they are our best teachers, for sure, if we will listen.
Well, speaking of this teaching process and learning process, I'm curious about what's something that's been going on for you and your family in the pandemic where you've been renegotiating some of your dynamics. Laura mentioned kid comes home from college and it's not the same as when they were home in high school. And I was a little worried about that when our son was here for a couple months, and it turned out to be an incredibly huge gift to get this time with him and kind of establish a new kind of relationship. But it did take some renegotiating. And I'm curious if others have been in this experience of trying to find new dynamics as we're sheltering in place together.
Sure. Can I jump in real quick? Sure.
Please.
So as it seems like everyone here has children who are potentially a little older than mine. So as you know, a 15-year-old daughter, you're renegotiating positioning every day. And so I feel that it's just one of those things that I've come to accept as part of what we're going through, and just try to lean in and have those conversations. And I try not to allow it to affect me as much, because to a certain extent, it's kind of what's expected at this moment. Maybe it's trickier given that we have quarantine and we have all these dilemmas. So there are even more factors, because even in normal times, 15-year-old daughters, have a lot of things going on. And so, that's what I would say with that. The other thing I would mention goes back to some of what Laura was saying when you asked her about purpose, and she went in on time, right? Spending time with the children. And I feel that as parents, we often underestimate the value of what some of us consider to be a small thing. In my view, time, it's the fourth dimension. It's the most valuable thing I have. And one of the things I did years ago was kind of articulate what I think is most important to me, and then jot down how I actually spend my time. And for most people, and myself at that point, when I did that, it was completely off kilter, right? Like any parent you ask, my kids are the most important thing to me. But then when you look at how you spend your time, for most parents, the time with the kids is minute. And so that's something that I wanted to fix. And so with respect to time, especially now, so over the last 6 years, especially during the summers, I've had this thing called Daddy Camp. And so literally, obviously I work and I have a lot of work to do, but I incorporate them in different things I have going on and create curriculum, short-term projects, long-term projects. I'm an advisor, investor in their businesses. We do a lot of different things. And initially, it was kind of an inside joke on my part back in 2015. But then afterward, I found that they enjoyed it and they're looking forward to the next one. So each year, it just got more and more involved. And so whereas this year, for example, my daughter applied to a college and she had this whole summer thing going on, and obviously it's not happening. Well, the default, we have a default, right? And it's been established and it's not that different. And she can kind of come up with her own ideas. So, for me, that's kind of one specific, because I know one of the things, Josh, you mentioned that you want us to share certain tools that could be useful. That's something that I found to be super useful. And then also, even going back to Khalil and that, we're just conduits and, they have to live their lives. I agree. Now, one of the ways I've found that helps not go around completely, but if you do things with your kids from the time when they're super young and they get into them and you're into it as well, then you may end up having at least a couple of things that you do together. So for example, my kids and I do martial arts together. So even my 15-year-old, she's a black belt. We teach the toddlers together. And so even though it's 30 minutes a week that we do this thing together, it's a thing. And I didn't actually realize the potential benefit long-term when we started, but now I'm seeing a lot of these rituals. So in as far as you can create rituals with your children, it becomes super beneficial as they get older and they're going through difficult times, or if they're just challenging times that are happening, because those become fallbacks. So, yeah.
Jacques, that is so impressive. And I don't know if I want to teach my toddlers how to become black belts, but I will say that I'm taking notes because that's amazing. And the other thing I would add in terms of renegotiation that I'm experiencing is renegotiating parenting alongside my partner and trying to figure out, because we're both working from home and both, needing to be parents during this time, trying to map out some kind of a schedule, which is so not like us, but seemed it needed to happen to survive the pandemic and be great parents, was to kind of figure out, okay, when are you going to work and when are you going to parent, and when am I going to parent and when are you going to work? And in a way that's actually been, I think, a really facilitating factor for our own mental health too, is to establish some kind of routine that we can rely on in the midst of all of this chaos and uncertainty. It's providing some kind of structure, and negotiating that as partners, as parents, has been really beneficial for me.
I imagine with little ones, it's very intense. One of the parents of young children I know said to me, what I've recalibrated is my expectations of what good parenting is at this time. If we don't have to go to the hospital, it was a good day. There's a very simple baseline.
Perhaps if I could come in here as well. There was two things that I saw, and I think the one is we've got a social crisis and we have a financial crisis. And from a financial crisis, I think my kids could see, because they've got friends as well, even from a middle class perspective, that you can have a lot at one point in time, and overnight you actually lose it, because within a month people lost jobs. Both parents lost jobs, and they had good jobs. So there was financial crisis. And I think what comes out of this then is to look at the social side of things as well, in terms of, one, share whatever you've got, even if it is a little. You can still share. They say in every plate of food there's always space for two. One thing that I've done is with my older kid, I've given him the responsibility. As parents, they shouldn't know what's going on in your wallet and your finances and things like that. It's a bit too personal. But what I've given him the task now is to say, you take over the budget of the house, and I want you to start recording what is our income, what is our expenses, and then we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about where's waste, because now we can see anything can happen overnight. And so what I'm teaching him also is to say, don't take things for granted, and learn a skill to live humbly and live within your means, so that when crisis like this hits, you are not affected as badly. So I'm hopefully transferring skills in this moment in time as well. And last but not least, I've kind of become more punctual on every night before 10. You've got to put onto the wall your little statement of gratitude for the day, so that whatever happens in your life, you're always going to look at, what am I grateful for, irrespective.
I wanted to, Annie, go to you next, and also just mention this in the chat, because I know this is something that you work on, this balance, and there's also a cultural element, and Karma, thank you for bringing that up, that trying to find, how do we relate to our kids? How open is that relationship? What is our role really? Annie, what were you going to say?
That's a broad question. You guys are bringing up such wonderful things, and I love the practical aspects of them too. The takeaway for mental health that I wanted to offer was the creative expression aspect of it. When the child or the teenager is feeling that the world is changing too fast, and he or she doesn't know how to deal with the anxiety and the stress that's coming from just not knowing what even the fall is going to look like in terms of school and the resumption of social life and all that. The idea of using either art or photography or music or dance, any of those things that can be done as we shelter in place, I think is so vital to the ongoing understanding of where these emotions are taking me and how they can morph into something that may lead to a new passion, or now that we have less time that is designated for homework, what is it that you really want to be doing? What choices are you making during your day that bring you joy, bring you fulfillment, that help clarify some of the feelings that are going on with you? And as parents, how can we share in those kinds of creative expression activities? It's a really interesting opportunity for all of us. I've been doing Storytime FaceTime with my grandchildren, and we've been doing art every single day. And there's a new joy in that as I see what's coming out of their brain and their creativity on a piece of paper, and have them tell me about the drawings that they're doing. There are things that can be done, and I think creativity is a way to manage and balance where we're at in the world and how we see ourselves. It's a thing that I would recommend.
So we have the physical from martial arts, and also Kimita learning to exercise from her daughter, and brave fun, good on ya. And then the creative expression. Kevin has a different strategy, which is turning his children into coaches for him. So we have the financial management strategy, we have the physical strategy, we have the art strategy, we have the coaching strategy. And then there's this other piece, which Dina, I just wanted to say this, I really grieved this time when my kids started to say, I want to kind of do my own thing. And I missed the things that we did together, but we did find new things. And this was as I said, one of the unexpected gifts of this pandemic was hanging out with my 19-year-old son while he was learning to play guitar, and wishing I was learning to play guitar too, but just listening to him and kind of singing along. And there are new things we find. So.
Josh, I play some table tennis now with my kids during this pandemic, and sometimes we think as parents, you want to be so cool that your kids kind of look at you and say, "Oh, look at this happening, fool," because you're just trying too hard. But I think you just got to take it in your stride. And one thing I realized, table tennis was something they enjoyed and I enjoyed, and I kind of gave them a run for their money. And within that challenge, they kind of saw the cool side without me having to try to be cool, to think that, hey, the old man is showing me a thing or two here. So sometimes we shouldn't try too hard. We should just find something that's both enjoyable to your kid and you, and just flow with it.
Yeah.
Hey, if I could jump in, each of you have said wonderful things. That as I hear your comment around the budget for the house and the kids, I'm definitely gonna flatter you by imitating it. If we stay in touch, I'll keep you posted on how that goes, because I thought that was really interesting. The creativity and the art on the side of Annie, that's been a big thing in our family, and the kids really enjoy that. And so thanks for those ideas. With respect to what you mentioned, Josh, in terms of the children wanting their own space, it's definitely been happening, and it led me to make sure that I wanted to correct a bit of what I said before, because I said in terms of a hierarchy of importance, I had the kids at the top, and that's a common error of us parents. And I've made it, and obviously I continue to make that. So we have to be at the top. And, I've definitely taken steps in the last decade where, there's time for me. I've been meditating daily. So I think it's important that you always make sure that you're first. Now, obviously you're going to take care of your kids, but you're still super important, because they're not children forever, right? And so the sadness that's been described often happens when a parent's world revolves around their children. And I think it's important that we get ahead of that. We treat ourselves with respect. And if you need to frame it so that it still works with your children, you're teaching them how to be thoughtful adults and prioritize themselves. And they're learning it from how you do it yourself. So if you don't take care of yourself, then your kids are likely not to either. It could shift, but likely not. So, yeah.
I wanted to say something about that. From this end of parenting where I am, cooking is something that I've always really enjoyed doing with our children. And now that they have their own homes, and in my son's case, his own children, we actually do virtual baking every Saturday together. So sourdough starter, we both got into that, and we choose a recipe during the week, and we bake it together. And these are lifelong interests. These are shared interests that then they are now sharing with their children. It's legacy. I mean, it's really cool to now we have more time to be connected in new ways, and so thank goodness for the technology and these foundations of connections you're making with your children now will lead into the next generation.
I was just remembering when my kids were really little, I wrote an article about making pancakes with my son, and he must have been 3, because at first the egg breaking went like this, and and now he's a really good cook. And it's interesting how we see some of the things do take years and years and years before before they become, I don't know, it's a fruit that ripens slowly, I guess. And maybe it's not something we create, but something we contribute to. Laura, do you have another thought about, I'm really concerned about what's going on for kids right now, especially, in this conversation, young adults. Are we facing, is this going to be something that's a trauma for them for the next, are they going to be in therapy about this in 20 years?
There is so much variability in what students are experiencing, but I think it is important to recognize that mental health issues were on the rise among young adults nationwide in the US already before the pandemic. We saw anxiety and depression climbing each year for young people overall. And I think, unfortunately, we are anticipating that the pandemic and other factors are kind of layered onto that. And I think it's important to anticipate that, for young adults who had pre-existing mental health issues, they are likely experiencing some exacerbated symptoms during the pandemic. There may be young adults who are experiencing mental health issues for the first time under the pandemic. And we need to be aware that that's a possibility and know what to look for in terms of signs that a young adult might be struggling. If they are experiencing kind of, long-term feelings of anxiety or sadness or depression, they could be experiencing a diagnosable issue, and we should not hesitate to reach out for mental health support, professional support, if we think that could be worth looking into. It's better to err on the side of going to support too soon than to err on the side of not going for support and then realizing that actually this is something that isn't going away on its own and needs to be dealt with. So I do think that's something we should be aware of as parents and keep an eye out for, and not hesitate to look into connecting our young adults with services if they need to.
That was a very scary and a huge amount of uncertainty for me as a parent when we were wondering if our kids needed professional help with mental health. And particularly given the work that I do, I was like, they have all these tools, there's all this support they already have, and realizing that is not my job as a parent. I'm not their coach, I'm not their counselor, but also that there are things that are beyond, there are clinical issues that need clinical care, and that just accepting that's like the metaphor that I liked is when you have a hole in the bucket, no matter how much you keep filling that bucket, it's not going to get full. And so all of the great things that we're talking about relational support and habits and everything that we can contribute to our children's lives, there is a very large number of kids who are struggling with a clinical level of mental health challenge, and the clinical support doesn't solve it, but it helps kind of plug that hole in the bucket so that other things can come in to help.
Yeah. And Josh, I think too, we could help our young adults understand that mental health exists on a spectrum. And to some degree, we can all relate to what it's like to experience mental health issues, and mental health issues are common. And so, you know, the number one thing that I feel for young adults right now who might be struggling for the first time is I hear young adults say, this isn't me. You know, what I'm experiencing right now, this isn't me. And I think, you know, there's still a lot of stigma associated with mental illness. And so if we can have that conversation with our young adults too, and let them know that it is common and that we all experience mental health challenges, no matter what they may be, then when they really do need support, then they will feel hopefully more comfortable seeking help and accepting, you know, that they need help.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, I can't remember ever having so much stress and emotional complexity in my days. And so, you know, I think for all of us, this isn't the normal time.
I just think also, Josh, in terms of this, that we should just caution not to transpose our fears and our anxieties onto our children. We're in a category at a certain age where we have less time, and therefore we need to do a whole lot more. And I would like to think that they are resilient and they are creative and they are more resistant. And so we need to cultivate that within them so that they can start making choices to bring that to the fore and solve their issues. Just an example, in personally, I mean, I grew up where my father died at the age of 5, and my mother was a factory worker. At some point, I went through school, I went through varsity. My mother didn't have a cent, but when I finished varsity, I didn't have a cent to pay because I found a way to do it by doing 2-3 jobs. But we became creative. And I think as parents, sometimes along the line, we lose that creativity to our children, or we don't allow our children to utilize the same creativity to solve their problems. In my instance, I was forced to solve it. There was no backup other than emotional backup to hold me and to cuddle me and to tell me things are going to be okay. But I was allowed to be creative and solve. And so we just need to caution not to transpose our own anxiousness and anxiety onto our children and complicate it even further. This is something my son told me. He says, what I would appreciate is that, you know, before this, I would ask, you know, you're getting to a stage of your life where there's purpose, and what are you going to do? And you're going to be a father, and how are you going to look after your family? And he says, well, I've learned to let go of that because I'm making matters worse. And all I need to do is just support the way he's navigating his life and support it with good qualities and good characteristics that I can influence him with.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end, Jacques Philippe. You get the last word.
Why, thank you. And feel free to cut me off as soon as it's time to cut me off. You know, Zahir, I feel like we're sharing a brain. So I second everything you said, especially around the transposing of our own anxiety to our children. I wanted to go back to the topic of the protests and Black Lives Matter. You know, we talked about it a bit earlier, and I approached it from a very high level, practical perspective. But, you know, I do think it's a super important period of time that we're going through. I think, you know, the general population, those who are not directly affected, so those who are not Black male and, you know, Black women, it's actually, I would say, almost more a societal issue than the issue of me as a Black person, right? And the history as it has unfolded over time, right? Like with Trump and the fact that a racist was voted and put into office, you know, it's helped to foment these issues, and that's part of the reason you're seeing such widespread protests. And earlier I put into the chat that a South African, Stephen Biko, who was one of the leaders during apartheid, he wrote under the pseudonym Frank Talk, and he talks about the complicity of the white majority and those who call themselves progressives and liberals who actually benefit from the status quo. And, part of the way that, and, to a certain extent, society and the issues that people of African descent are having in the United States is a mirror for the rest of society, right? It's like how you treat the least of, yours is really a true reflection of who you are. And as you think about it within the context of your children, and even with dealing with these types of things, oftentimes having a challenge that is bigger than yourself is liberating, right? So part of what Zahir was talking about, like he went through some serious challenges. Well, it helped to create character. And so now when he has conversations, he's able to dig in and relate to people in a way that he otherwise wouldn't. So one of the greatest gifts that you can provide to your children is ensure that they understand the history of this country in a real way, not just what's taught in the books, which is fanciful, and that they become part of the solution and not the problem, and to understand that there is no middle ground, right? And you're never too young, because the people, the adults we become are actually formed when we're younger, when we're teenagers. And I think it's important that us as parents spend the time to inform them, inform ourselves, and be part of the solutions. Because if you're not part of the solution, and you end up, if you already know kind of Steve Biko's writings, or you look at it, you'll find that if you're not part of the solution, you're actually literally part of the problem. And oftentimes we don't realize that. And, I just encourage that everyone's tuning in, that you make sure you're participating in the solution in a meaningful way, putting EQ and emotional intelligence to the forefront of how you make those decisions, right? These are lives, these are real people. And, we're often prioritizing economic benefits and other benefits over literally the lives of other humans. And I think it's important that we be honest with respect to where we stand. And so, I just want to make sure I share that perspective as well.
I'm grateful for you sharing that, Jacques-Philippe. And also, there's elements of racism that are individual and personal, and then there are elements that are systemic. And I was actually thinking about my 21-year-old is pushing me on the systemic issues, and I'm feeling really overwhelmed by that because it just seems so complicated. And I was actually thinking about actually the work that you do in your day job is really a great example of addressing one of the systems that's part of perpetuating racism. So thank you both for what you said and for the work you're doing to be part of dismantling that system. I also wanted to mention, those of you who are interested in this topic, I just put in the chat, Amber Coleman Mortley is a civics educator and the author of Mom of All Capes. And she is going to be on with the New York Times tomorrow. So about 34 hours from now. And I think if you're interested in this, think about how do you really bring this anti-racist focus into your conversations with your kids. I recommend that you join Amber, and she's also going to be joining us on a panel on equity in education in a couple of weeks. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, people who are watching and engaging in the chat. I appreciate that people have been here interacting and sharing. And those of you who are watching the recording, please add your comments and ask us questions, and we will come back and answer and engage and use that as part of our thinking about future panels. So with that, Tom, we'll go back to you, and thank you, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists for this awesome conversation. I think parenting is one of the toughest jobs on the planet, right? It's a job where we don't really know what we're doing until we're in it, and you have to do it. And I don't have kids, but I have friends who do, and I like to talk to my parents about that kind of stuff. And I found this conversation very useful, and I hope you did too. And it was kind of a heavy start, and then we kind of had an uplifting moment of sharing some really great techniques. And then at the end, we really brought it down again to the practical, which I think was really useful. So thank you for all this great journey that we had in this last hour. If you want to support us, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, tell your friends, and let us know what you would like us to cover in the comment section below. Tell us what's the topic that you would like to hear us talk about. And yeah, with that, I'll leave you, and I hope to see you next week for our panel on management, Tuesday, 8 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you.
If this was helpful, would you please comment, like, share, and subscribe? The Emotional Intelligence Network is your community to grow and practice EQ. At 6 Seconds, that means being smarter with feelings. And we're here to provide practical, proven EQ tools so workplaces, schools, and people can thrive everywhere in the world. Be sure to visit 6seconds.org to find the complete suite of resources, assessments, and programs. Thank you for watching.